Thank you so much for that really generous introduction. As a conservationist and a firefighter, I could talk about this all day, so if I do drone on a bit too long, just tell me to hurry up. But I'm very happy to answer questions at the end. So today I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the Volunteer Wildfire Services, just very briefly, what we do, how we operate, and then from our perspective, fynbos and fire. Some of you will have heard or already know about fynbos and its adaptations to fire, but I'm just going to go through the basics so that you really understand why we are doing fire suppression in a fire-driven ecosystem. It's always a question we get. Our tagline used to be holding the line between fire and fynbos, and we got a lot of flack for it, but it is it's what we do, but under specific circumstances. And then I'll go through wildfires in the urban context, and that really just brings together why we do what we do. And also why it might affect you when we have fires as well. So, Volunteer Wildfire Services, we are a non-profit organization, volunteer-based completely. We only recently now have a paid CEO who, because we've grown so big. But we started in 1999. Just before, just in time for the 2000 fires, Table Mountain fires, for those who remember that chaos. Yeah. We have about, at the moment, we've drastically increased our numbers in the last year or two. We are at about 300 members. Not at one station. We have 4 stations, so we have, we have 4 stations. 2 on the Cape Peninsula, so Newlands is our oldest and our original station, and that is situated at Newlands Fire Base, where Table Mountain National Parks is as well by the nursery. And then we have our South Peninsula station, which is fairly new, but not that new anymore. It's about 10 years old almost, and that is near Jake's in Murdoch, by Avonmouth Circle. So we have a South Peninsula station, which really just helps us cover and have quick access to the rest of the peninsula as well, because it takes a lot of time to get from Newlands to Cape Point if there's a fire. Then we have a Stellenbosch base, which is probably around 15 years now, which used to be Jonkershoek, but it is now called Stellenbosch, and it's situated on a farm in Stellenbosch, and then they have a satellite station at Helderberg Nature Reserve. So we have the Helderberg station as well. So across those 4 stations, we have 300 plus members. And then we don't just go to fires on our own. That's not how it works. We have memorandums of understanding with conservation partners or with fire agency partners. So obviously on the peninsula, we work under the guidance of SANParks, for Table Mountain National Park specifically. If there's a fire, they use their own resources first. If they need more help, they call us. So we are not sometimes we are, we're not always the initial fire services that go out. Because we are volunteers, we can't always guarantee that we will have people to go out. Stellenbosch and Helderberg, we service or help Cape Nature with their fire suppression efforts. And then we have recently signed up with City of Cape Town Biodiversity Management Branch. Like I said, we have a station at Helderberg Nature Reserve, which is a city nature reserve. But if Zandvlei Nature Reserve has a really big fire and they need extra support, or if they have a prescribed burn, they will sometimes call us as well. So we do help with those. We do also have an MOU with Winelands Fire Protection Association, which is a group of landowners. It's more of an insurance body. And then Overberg District Municipality, as well as Overstrand Municipality. So we really, some of these we are first call for. So Newlands, if Table Mountain National Park is having a fire and Overstrand is having a fire and they call us, we have to service Table Mountain National Park first, because we have a stronger contract with them, if that makes sense. We are we've signed to be that they'll get our resources first before some of the other partners, and the other partners understand that. So it gets a bit complicated, but we do help a lot of other partners. And then ad hoc, we went to the Neisner fires, other big fires where they need more resources. So how do we work? We have a big recruitment drive in about March, April every year. And we have multiple roles, critical support, so logistics, servicing of equipment. We have people who can join just to help us with our events, just to be at our events and speak to people. We have logistics, which is a fire role, where people come in and make sure there's enough, all the donations that come in get split up between the resources. We have a planning team, which sits at base and records real-time information about the fire and is really just an intelligence hub for all fire operations. We have people who join us just to help us with fundraising as well. And then obviously a lot of people join us because they want to be in the flames and be a firefighter. But we also have drivers, drivers only. And then we have marketing people as well. But anyone can do multiple roles. I've been a firefighter, driver, planning officer as well. I'm a first aider. It really depends on how much time you have to train. So once we've recruited in March, April, then we have winter season is our training season. So from March, April, all the way through to September, October. And we train, we do hikes, we do scenarios where we train to use equipment. And we make sure that all of our trainees, our new people and our old people, every member has to go through the same training every year to make sure that we're on top of that information and new practices. And then at the end of our training season, everyone has to go through evaluations. So we get evaluated on all of those skills that we've learned during the season, as well as things like fire safety and our theoretical knowledge. And that just means that everyone is always trained up to the same standard. So we hold our safety and our training standard really, really to a high level. And then once you pass training, you get kitted out. It is expensive to kit out a firefighter. Most of the things on this side, this is actually from my brother's kit, so he was a scout, he always has too many things. But they're always come in handy, you know he's got something if you need it. But everything except the backpack is issued, so we get a helmet, we get a flash hood, which helps with radiant heat and smoke. We get goggles, fire-resistant goggles, a cotton t-shirt, cotton shirt, a leather belt, cotton pants, and then leather boots, all rated to a certain temperature. And then gloves as well, usually leather gloves. Everything except the socks and the bag, we kit out our volunteers with. There is a deposit that's paid, but you get that back if you leave the unit, as long as you hand all your stuff back. I think the latest figure is it's about 6 to 7 grand to kit out one firefighter. Just with wildland gear, we're not using anything really fancy, but it really comes down to those goggles, the boots. We need to make sure that we use a high standard of safety gear so that we don't, we don't die. So we can do what we're meant to do. And as we're non-profit, everything we do other than our fundraising events, we rely on public goodwill, basically. Everything else is optional, but we do always, our firefighters always carry 4 liters of water, as well as at least 4 liters of water, as well as food, because we never know how long we're going to be on the line for. A firefighter can sweat through a liter of water every half an hour in a very, very hot environment, if it's very intense, especially if it's a 30-degree day. So we need to make sure that we always have enough stuff with us, as well as hydration, first aid, all of that stuff as well. So there's a lot that goes into that. And then once we've trained and we've got our equipment, most of the time we are hiking into fires. So we mainly have hand crews. That is our big contingent of volunteers. And what that means is it's firefighters that walk in with manual tools. We only use water if water is there. And often, high up in the mountains, there's no water there, vehicles can't access, so we have to hike in. Table Mountain National Park, it's not too much of a hike, maybe an hour or so max. But when we start helping Cape Nature in the big wilderness areas, for example, we could do a 2-3 hour hike into the fire, then work, and then hike. So it is quite physically demanding, but we train for that. So that is our training. We also are often in areas that are difficult to access. Obviously, we won't go in if it's not safe. But yeah, we're often traversing and firefighting in very treacherous terrain, and we have to get quite creative with how we move through that landscape. And often that means that if there is an inaccessible area, sometimes all we can do is sit and watch, and just hold the line somewhere more accessible. So what we do when we get to the fire is we do fire suppression, which is just putting out the fire. It's just a fancy word for that. And most of the time we're using beaters, which you would have seen, but it's rubber flaps on a broom handle essentially. And what that does is, as we work in a team, but it essentially smothers the fire. So we're not flapping and fanning the fire, we're dropping it on the fire and smothering it out, and then moving as a team to try and get that out. So it really depends on the vegetation. But then we also have rake hoes, which is just your standard rake hoe, rake on one side, hoe on the other, and we use that to actually dig out and create what we call scratch lines. So it actually separates the burnt vegetation from the unburnt vegetation, to try and control that line and make sure it doesn't ignite and go around us, basically. But we will always work in what we call the black. So we work in the burnt area so that if it does flare up, we can just step back into what's already burnt and we're safer. There's a lot more that goes on into fire safety and fire behavior, but that's just a quick one. As you can see, we do work right up against flame, if it is manageable. If that was 2-3 meter flame, we wouldn't be that close. You can't get that close. Our uniform only protects us so much, and it's really just to get us in quickly, but we can't sustain a fire, we can't work on a fire line right up against the fire all the time, which is a little bit of a misconception. Some people say, oh, why aren't you on the fire line? But it's just not possible. We do use water when it's available, but hoses need a water source, and they only go so far. So you can connect a lot of hoses together, but you're not going to get more than maximum 500 meters, and then you need a really, really strong pump on the other end. So we only use water where we have access to it, and also where it is going to be our best option. We can hold a line on a road, for example, so if this is a road, but obviously we can't get water other than a knapsack, which is only 25 liters, it doesn't go far. We can't really carry water into mountains, so that's where helicopters come in. Something really, really important that we do is often, most of the time, we are not looking at pretty flames. Often it is literally just sitting and observing, making sure that anything that was burning doesn't flare up again. So you can see there's a little bit of smoke there. That's what we would call a hot spot. So someone would walk up to that and then use a rake or open it up, make sure it burns out properly and doesn't sit there smoldering for 2 or 3 days and then start another fire. So mop-up is really, really important, and it's something that gets overlooked. Often when there's lots of nice flame on the mountain, everyone helps all the firefighters, but then they forget about the 2 or 3 days afterwards that people are sitting there watching to make sure that that doesn't start up again. And that is most of what we do, especially because we're not the first call resource. We often come in to relieve other crews and other agencies that are there, that are paid to be there, but have been on the line for too much time and they can't stay on. So we usually come in and step in. So it's a lot of mop-up, which we call extreme gardening. It's really just opening stuff up, making sure that everything is neat around the edge of that fire so that the unburnt stuff and the burnt stuff don't mix again. We do also obviously work with other agencies, so this is the Table Mountain National Parks. tanker and some of their crews as well. We work alongside and with those agencies because of the way, I didn't put it in here because it's also a whole other thing, but we call it the incident command system or the incident management structure or system, and it really is, there's one person in charge of that fire and we get brought in as resources underneath that, so we all know where we're supposed to be and who we're supposed to report to. So it's not even as well-meaning as people are when they show up with buckets and hoses to help. It does mean you're inserting yourself into a system that is already, communication structures are already put in. It's also when, if there's a volunteer organization that just rocks up, it's really difficult to know who they are, where they're working, and then you don't have any communication with anyone else, so then things can go a little bit haywire. So we see that sometimes where it is a farmer, for example, protecting his own land, comes in with his own team and starts a backburn, not knowing that there are fire resources on the other side of that mountain, and he's now started a fire towards them. So it really has to all fit into that structure, and that's something that we really, really train on. We've also come a very long way. This was 2006. We had a bakkie that we put people on the back of to go to fires. But we've come a long way. We have, you've probably seen our Land Rovers, transits, and then we have a tanker as well. And we also have some skid units. So we do have water on vehicles, but most of our vehicles are just crew transport. It's just to get crews in and out. We also train to work with and under helicopters. It is not just a helicopter coming to drop water. They don't put the fire out. What they do is they cool the fire down enough for a hand crew to get closer. So the hand crews work in tandem with the helicopters. It means that the helicopter, obviously, if the hand crews aren't there yet, the helicopters will go up and just try to slow the fire down. Sometimes if it's just a smoldering thing, they can just stop and drop all their water on it. But usually it's a mist spray, and that we have to learn to be safe underneath helicopters. We need to be able to brace and move out the way when a helicopter comes in, because sometimes those buckets are a little bit lower than expected, and they are 3,000 meters of water coming at you quickly is not fun. Also, if they drop, sometimes they drop quite low, and you don't want to be anywhere near that water. So we do train to move out the way. Helicopter comes through, and as soon as that helicopter is clear, we rush in and then get to work with hand tools so that we can suppress that fire. Because sometimes that flame is just too hot, but the helicopters really help with that. We also have now a heli-tac crew that goes to fynbos every Saturday, I think, during high fire season, and they will be trooped in with a helicopter. So the helicopter flies them in, drops them off, they work, and then picks them up and takes them to place. So that's been quite helpful. And then we have standbys. So we have crews, depending on the partner. For Table Mountain National Parks, we have crews on duty Saturdays and Sundays during high fire season, which is 1st of November to the end of April, sometimes into May, most of the time into May actually, because fires are just getting later and later. And then, so just to help boost their sort of skeleton resources on weekends and public holidays, we have a Christmas standby as well. We always joke that it's the people who don't want to see their families on Christmas will sign up. They usually are the ones who will sign up for a Christmas standby. So for half a day, we will go and sit at base and be on first call for fires. And then in the background, while all of this is happening, there are, like I said, logistics and other things. We also have a planning team, which I head up, which sits at base and does real-time mapping, situational info, tracking of resources, who's on the fire, what are they doing, what is happening with the fire, what sections are moving, and then we feed that information back to the operations to help them do their job better. And we're also looking at weather forecasts, predicting what the fire might do if it gets to a certain area as well. So it's quite cool. I feel like the guys on, I don't know, NCIS or CSI, when they're sitting in the background and there's an operative going through a building and you tell them there's a door to the left, that's what we're doing. And then we feed that information back as well, and that's what you see in those press releases. So these maps that are released, all these burn area estimates, that's all coming from our planning office. And then we're also obviously looking at larger weather systems 2-3 days in advance in case the fire carries on. And then looking at satellite images and mapping those fires as well. There's some really cool tools that we use. I really like planning. If anyone wants to join the planning team, please do. Okay, so I'm going to try and go through this really quickly because I'm going to take very long if I don't. You might have heard this before, or some of these concepts before, but I really just want to go through fynbos and fire and why we have fire in fynbos. So we know that the Cape Floral Kingdom, hopefully, is, so there's 6 world floral regions, and we have the Cape Floral Kingdom. You can see it's only a little bit of red at the bottom of Africa. That is the smallest floral kingdom, or floral region, and it is basically the Western Cape into a little bit of the Northern Cape and the Eastern Cape. It has the most plants per unit area. So it is the most diverse for its size. There are more plants in your rainforest and things as well, but we have really a high diversity just for the size. It is a lot to do with, so it's technically classed as in the world biomes as a Mediterranean scrub or forest or woodland. But really, what I just wanted to show you was that we have fynbos on the west coast of South Africa. But if you look, California, Spain, Chile, and Australia, all the west coasts have very, very similar vegetation. So very scrubby, dense, small-leaved plants, and that is because of the cold west coast currents, which gives us our Mediterranean climate. So we have so it's winter rainfall, dry, hot summers, and pretty much, actually all of those are fire-driven. So they all experience fire. So we can learn a lot from California fires, Australian fires. We're learning we're learning a lot from them just because they have very similar ecosystems to us. We know that the fynbos biome has proteas, ericas, and restios. Yeah, those are the main 3 that it has to have one or more of to be classed as fynbos. But really, we have so many other things that are part of that biome as well. So I just wanted to show you, for those who don't know, proteas aren't just these fancy things. There are cerurias, mimites, there's so many other genre in the protea family, as well as your cone bushes and your pincushions. Those are all proteas. And then we have ericas. I don't have my stats with me, but we have, I think in the whole of the UK, they have heath, which is similar, part of the same family. I think they have about 21 species in the whole of the UK. We have almost 800 in South Africa, so maybe more. I might be wrong, I'll double check for you. So we really do have a high biodiversity as well. And then obviously our restios, which are just, I've never got into restio identification because it's very confusing. So yeah, we have a lot of diversity in bulbs, carnivorous plants, wildflowers, a lot of daisy family, Asteraceae. So it's not just the proteins we have to look after, but yes, all of this together also supports a lot of fauna. We don't have a huge diversity because it's not a very productive landscape. Our soils are very nutrient poor compared to the rest of the country at least. But we do have endemics and fynbos specialists like Cape Craceborg and Cape Sugarbirds as well. So we need to remember the animals too. Fynbos also have, or species, a lot of them are adapted to fire. They wouldn't have survived if we've had natural fires for thousands of years. If they weren't. So over time they've evolved with a number of adaptations to thrive in and even encourage fire in the system. So things like myrmecoccary, so ants, relationships with ants that take the seeds, they're very nice tasty seeds, underground and eat the outer casing off, and then those seeds are protected from fire because they're underground. Things like invasive ants have messed that up a bit, but it's almost exclusive to fynbos ecosystems, which is very cool. And then we obviously have cones, so serotiny, so protected seeds, which with heat, those cones open and those seeds are released. So only under those circumstances. Things like reseeding versus resprouting, I won't go into all of that, but it's different adaptations or responses to fire. Either they will have a lot of cones that will throw out a whole lot of seeds after a fire, and the adult plant dies, or the adult plant has so much carbon storage that it protects itself and that rootstock survives, and it just resprouts from that rootstock. So there's lots of cool things. Obviously, grasses and restios and bulbs, they just grow from the bulb again. This is just an example of smoking seeds. Not that kind of smoking. When you are doing fynbos restoration, which I'm sure a lot of you are involved in, you do have to smoke or heat treat seeds before they will actually germinate. So they've developed that smoke-induced or heat-induced or combination of seed germination as well. And then other things like chemical content. So metallasias, your slungbos or your helichrysums, they all have oils in them that mean when they burn really bright and really flashy and really quickly, which doesn't damage them as much. That makes sense. So it's not a slow burn. So that's, this here you can see is, I didn't doctor that photo, that is white fire. Just from, it was actually Bruner's and Erica's, but it is just really, really flashy fuel. Burns really quickly, it means it doesn't burn, it doesn't generate a lot of heat because it's very quick. And then on the other end, proteas, where they have this lot of carbon storage, it means that they don't smolder. So they'll burn a bit and char on the outside, but they won't sit and burn for days. So we talk about fires in fynbos are meant to be cool fires. They're meant to be quick and either quick or slow, but not really intense. And I'll talk about alien invasive species, but that's where that gets messed up later. I'm going to skim through this very quickly because I feel like I'm going to run out of time. Fynbos biome is also made up of 3 different fynbos complexes, which is very confusing. Don't get bogged down in the terminology, but basically fynbos can be really variable. So this is the complex, fynbos complex within the fynbos biome. And it's very confusing, don't get too worried about it. But this is where you have all the major elements, so proteas, restios, and ericas. And you can see, that it can look really different. Different types of fynbos communities can look really, really different from each other. But if they've got proteas, restios, ericas, you know it's fynbos. It's usually on sandy, sandstone and granite soils. And the reason I'm going through all of these with you is that each vegetation type and plant community has a different burning interval. We like to say, oh, fynbos needs to burn every 10 to 30 years. That is very general and doesn't apply to a lot of vegetation types. So 5 to 50 years or 10 to 30 years average, but depending on what plants are in that community and what your oldest maturing species is, it might need fire every 5 years, it might need fire only every 50 years. So just keep that in mind. We like to just lump everything together, but it's really different. Then we have Renosterfeld, which is also a fynbos type of complex. It's really a shrubland, grassland mix. There's not a lot of grasses in fynbos, but in Renosterfeld, that's where most of them are. So that's your Signal Hill, it's supposed to be Proteus State, and then your lower lying areas as well. And then the Overberg is all Renosterfeld. Characterized by Renosterbos. It used to be Areocephalus, but they've changed it again. It's very confusing. But it's just shrubs. There's a lot of debate as to what the ratio between grasses and shrubs is supposed to be. But because of it's historically been used as grazing land and farming land, so we don't actually know what a typical Renosterfeld looks like. but it's usually in clay-rich shale or granite soils. Renosterfeld has to burn a lot more frequently. So every 2 to 10 years, depending. When I was in the city of Cape Town, we tried to do a prescribed ecological burn on 10-year-old Renosterfeld. It didn't want to burn because there was no understory. So it couldn't carry a fire, which meant that it should have burned 2-3 years before that at least. So you start running into problems if that fire interval is wrong. Obviously, if you burn it every 2 years, you're going to have way fewer shrubs because they won't have time to grow and establish. If you leave it longer, there'll be just shrubs and no understory. So you have to get the balance right, depending on where you are. But we leave that up to the conservationists. And then Strandveld, this is your coastal vegetation. It's usually a dense shrubland, whether it's low or very thick or high. And it's broad-leaved plants, there's no proteas, and that's usually your cercia. And then some restios in your dune troughs where it's like seasonal wetland. High drainage, so very sandy soils, it's dune vegetation, basically, but obviously a little bit more inland to your on the beach vegetation. It shouldn't burn, really. So I don't know if anyone has experience with Strandveld, but it takes very, very long to recover from disturbance. So if you've seen a fire in the milkwood forests, for example, they take very, very long to recover and to come back. So it's also a debate on how often they should burn, but it means that really, they say at least 50 years just to get that thicket back up. So when there's a fire in Strandveld, we really want to get it out as soon as possible. And then the other thing that's really, really important when it comes to fire suppression and understanding fire is understanding fire succession. So has anyone heard of succession in plants? It's really just after disturbance, which is fire, trampling, herbivory, clearing, whatever, how that the stages of recovery afterwards. And that's really what fynbos comes down to, is how it recovers after fire. So you have the immediate phase, which is straight after fire. Within 24 hours, you can have seedlings coming up, you can have grasses regrowing or carrying on growing. So things like this, where you can see it was burnt there, and it's singed under the ground a little bit, but those plants keep growing. And then if you have no fire, let me just get my numbers right here. So it's usually up to almost a year can be considered immediate or post-fire. Then you go into your youth stage, which is just really young plants, up to 4 or 5 years, depending on your vegetation. Obviously, your youth phase of Renosterfeld, if it's 2-year succession, 2-year fire interval, is going to be a lot shorter. But things start coming back. Your ericas, your daisy species are usually the first to come up after that. Then you have your transitional phase, which you can see the leucodendrons are starting to establish a bit more. It can be up to 10 years, and you get your taller proteas in that as well. And then if you still have no fire, you get to a mature stage. That looks worse than it is because it's on a slope. But you get taller plants, your lower canopy starts dying out. So it's just that vegetation, and this is really where we want the fires to happen, is in this mature stage. So it's usually when your slowest maturing plants start producing seed and can carry on that species if there is a fire. And if it doesn't burn, then we get to senescence, which is really just everything starts dying, but hasn't had a fire yet. So there's no regeneration of those seeds that need heat and smoke to germinate. So obviously, if we have fire at the youth stage, it returns to immediate, and if you have fire at any other stage, it goes straight back to immediate. So this is where time of year comes into play. We really want fires towards the end of summer, just before the rains, so that's why a lot of prescribed burns happen in February, March, April, just before the first cold front, so that there's water to help those seedlings grow afterwards. If you have a fire during winter, it might not burn hot enough, you might not get enough heat. So yeah, when that fire happens and in what stage it happens really impacts that vegetation as well. And for us as firefighters, we need to know if we're going into a mature or senescent vegetation, because those flame heights are going to be huge, and it's going to burn, the fuel load is really high. But it also means that us in the planning office, we can say, oh, there was a fire 200 meters this way of you last year, so you can use that as a point to anchor your line, because the fire is going to burn itself out in very short vegetation. So it's really, really important we help sand parks maintain their vegetation age maps for that reason as well. So, sorry, that was a lot very quickly. Really, what does all of this mean, what we do, and just understanding a little bit more about vegetation and fire. When it comes to an urban context, there are human-derived challenges as well. So we've got the city of Cape Town, an area of just under 2,500 square kilometers. Just using this as an illustration of why we're dealing with the problems we are, just part of them. We used to have 25 vegetation types, which are vegetation units, fault types, whatever you learned. But obviously, Cape Town is not, it's not open land, natural land, most of it. So just a quick history. I like using this slide because it's very illustrative. But 1800s, really the only settlement was around what is now the reclaimed harbour. But 100 years later, you can see that settlements have gone around Signal Hill and down sort of the M5-ish area. By 1931, we've got Voortrekker Road and the N1, and then pretty much the M5 all the way down to Muizenberg is where most of the settlement is. 15 years later, you can see there's a lot of sprawling settlements coming up. 30 years after that, we can hardly see what's going on in the Cape Flats, at least in this section here. You can see the peninsulas started becoming fragmented as well, Somerset West too. And then 30 years after that, there's not a lot of continuous natural vegetation. This is actually from 2019, so it's even worse now. This is part of my master's, but basically everything black is urban or residential industry, so transformed built up land. Everything in the brown is agricultural or rural transformed land, and everything, okay, you can't really see much blue, but that's public open space, so that's parks, grassland, grass areas. And then you have proclaimed, which is the dark areas, so protected natural area, and then not proclaimed. Not proclaimed means it's natural area, it doesn't mean it's in pristine condition though. So you can see essentially what we've ended up with is this really fragmented landscape, which comes with a number of issues. So we don't have large-scale ecosystems anymore. We've got these tiny things where we have to essentially simulate ecosystem function, because it's not getting plant recruitment or animal recruitment from other areas. It means that we have to intensely manage those little bits of natural land that we have left. So it needs a lot of focus, and every day something else to happen most of the time. And then it also means that when we do have fire, we often need to suppress it, because sometimes it's the last remnant of that vegetation left, and it's not due for a fire. But then we also we often have too frequent fires because of the proximity to people. Something falls off your car and creates a spark. We've had dumping of tar on the side of the road that creates the hot tar creates a fire. We've had rubbish trucks on fire spewing embers into nature. So proximity to people means that there's a lot more ways that vegetation can catch a light, other than the usual rock falls lightning, something that would have naturally occurred. Sometimes spontaneous combustion as well, but we haven't studied that enough to know exactly when that happens. And then just things like glass bottles with very strong sunlight and heat and dry vegetation, that can also start fires as well. So it means that all these little isolated remnants have to be managed on their own. We can't manage the whole system as one. It also means that when fires happen, they happen really close to people. And obviously human life comes first, and then structures and infrastructure, and then the environment. The environment's a lot more resilient than we think, so it's not always, it never has been the priority, but obviously we want to, as conservationists and people interested in the environment, we want it to be a priority, but the ultimate reality is that human life comes first. So you can see here, this is from the 2015 fires, or this one at least, very, very close to agricultural land, that is food security for people as well, economy, so we really have to also insurance claims as well. So the Forests and Forest Fire Act of South Africa says that if a fire starts on your property and spreads to someone else's, you are liable unless you can prove you did everything you could to stop it. It's one of the only, or is the only act where you are guilty until proven innocent. So that's why there's always a lot of flack and counter-suing and suing of everyone in the chain of where that fire went to try and claim back the costs of those fires as well. So that's also something as a landowner, they don't want those fires to spread to other people's land. Yeah, and then obviously things like on roads, that fire is happening, but it also there's a potential to spread to people's houses as well. It means that we do a lot of fire suppression, structural protection. I think one other thing that I wanted to just really put into your heads is that in order for something to burn, it doesn't need to be touched by flame. Okay, so flame can cause a lot of heat, and literally from radiant heat, it can dry out everything in front of it, and things can just not magically, but they dry out so much that they combust. We have been on fires where fires are starting ahead of us just from the heat that is coming from behind us. So radiant heat, so it's having dry leaf litter in your gutters, having really dry plants or really dry grass. I remember the 2000 fires, I went to a school in Plumstead, our field caught alight. And that was just from a little bit of ember and some heat that was coming, and that grass got so dry. And a tiny little ember that came from Constantiaberg set our grass alight. So just keep that in mind. When it comes to things like the Neisner fire, there was a lot of speculation that a few kilometers ahead another fire started and that there was someone setting it. It doesn't have to be. It can be embers that travel up in the upper air currents. It can be pine cones, it can be leaves. Pines like to shoot their pine cones out as well. And if anyone knows Steenbras Dam, there's the island in the middle. That island's caught alight from a pine cone flung across exploding basically across the dam. So just keep that in mind. It doesn't, the Black Saturday fires in Australia, anyone's heard of those? There were, I think, 2 to 4 kilometer movements of embers starting fires in front of that fire, just because of the heat that carried it up. So just remember that fire doesn't have to be anywhere near your house for it to burn. Same with vegetation as well. So we do structural protection to make sure that stuff like that doesn't happen. Palm trees love catching embers, and that's why some of the UCT buildings were damaged because of the palm trees right next to them, catching embers and just the dry leaves that aren't cut off. Those like to go up. So we sometimes are sent to stand on that open edge and make sure nothing ignites as well. The other issue is suppression of fire. So obviously there was the fire brigade, their main job is to put out fires. That's their mandate. So what was happening historically is any fire there was, people put it out. So even if it was a fire where vegetation needed to burn, it was put out. That thinking has changed a bit, and we were working with, not us, but the fire industry in general. Sometimes if there's really, really old vegetation, just because it's been historically suppressed or it's really close to people's houses, if it does start burning naturally, or there's a fire that starts, we sometimes let it burn a little bit wider than we would, and obviously with all the right permissions, and then we stop it further out so that becomes an ecological burn at the same time. So that is really, really something that's changing, but that is also something that happens. So if there's an area that has been suppressed of fire historically, that means that if a fire does start there, it's going to be very intense, very hot, and quite dangerous as well. So we have that really, really high fuel load. That means that we are involved in prescribed burning, which is what used to be called control burns. We don't use control anymore. Okay. So it's a prescribed burn. It is a burn that area is purposely burnt, and it's usually for two things. Ecological, so it's usually an ecological burn, which is that area needs fire to regenerate. It hasn't been burnt in a long time, and the species are dying out, or it's a conservation concern. And then fuel reduction burns. So things like the stack burning that's been going on in Tokai. That's alien vegetation that's been burnt or been cut, and those stacks are there, but that's a fire risk. So they have to burn those stacks. And sometimes burning those stacks helps with restoration of that area as well. It means there's something to burn for the seed bank to come up if there is one. And that's what happened at Tokai, which was burning to get that seed bank up again. So there are two things. Obviously, also if an area hasn't burned for 50, 60 years, it will be done in a more controlled or in an environment with a lot more resources than are ever needed to try and make sure that that's burned safely. And that's usually to protect the structures and people as well. Obviously, alien vegetation is also very common where people are, and that is really, really just influencing fire behavior left, right, and center. So things like pines, Port Jacksons, all your acacias, your eucalypts, they all come from areas where they also experience fire. So these are species that are fire adapted, but they are outcompeting our fynbos species. So when there is a fire, they burn hotter, they burn more intensely, and they actually kill the fynbos underneath them, well, the fires, because they're too intense for the fynbos, so a lot of the seed bank doesn't survive. And then that means that those fires are actually a lot more dangerous for people as well. I think one thing that we also forget is invasive grasses. We don't often think of them as invasive plants, but grasses also influence how fires move through. And dry grass is just tinder, basically. It also affects your post-fire recovery, because those seeds that are too burnt aren't going to germinate. I'm almost done, I promise. So this is just an example of pines. You can see that, so there's some other vegetation here. This was in Deer Park, I think. But all the stumps, they burn, and they burn for a long time. So they smolder, and they create a lot of coal. We can't go in there with a beater unless you've got a lot of water to dump on it. It's going to take a really long time to burn out, and that's when those fires continue for multiple days. And even after it looks like it's put out, suddenly something else pops up in the middle of the burnt area or outside the burnt area, because that stump or those rootstocks are just burning through the ground for 3-4 days as well. So it's really, really difficult when a pine plantation does go up. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes there's not a lot of heat or fire, and then it's just the needles that burn, and that's fine. But when it really comes to the trees burning, they also fall over. It's really dangerous. We get what we call widow makers, which is trees falling over and hitting people The game campfire, when using tea burnt, there was we could hear trees falling over. We just had to make sure we were out of the zone. So yeah, and that one also, it was so hot that day that the branches above us were igniting, just with very small flame underneath. That's the day that it was spotting in front of us. Eucalypts as well. Eucalyptus trees have such a lot of leaf litter underneath. If that does catch, then they love to drop limbs. They love to drop branches. So all of that stuff will also burn and smolder, and they have really a lot of resin in them, and these are the trees you can hear boiling and popping on fires as well. So they burn really intensely and really hot. Funnily enough, the line of eucalyptus on Signal Hill is actually there as a fire break. So the fynbos vegetation around it is quite low. It's all Renosterveld, so they don't expect really big fires. And it was planted there years ago because it kills everything underneath. So there's no understory, which means that it's actually quite easy to stop the fire when it gets to that place. But it means it needs to be maintained. You can't have a lot of drop trees and things underneath it. Then things like Port Jacksons and acacias. You can see stuff burns underneath. They don't always burn all the way to the top. If they do, they burn quite intensely as well. But it means you have these really patchy, really dirty burns that are really difficult to get in and stop the stuff underneath. Especially if it's really, really thick. I think this is Roycross actually over here, but that's Port Jackson. So you can see there, we can't even really see where the edge of that line is to pull all that stuff back and make sure it doesn't carry on smoldering underneath. The other thing about it is that it makes it really difficult to access and for access and egress of areas. So it makes it unsafe. So we need to get to here where there's some pines and other things, but we need to walk through this big, thick stuff. We don't know if there's anything burning in there when we're in it. So it actually makes it quite dangerous to get in and out of fires as well. The other thing, and I think one of the main drivers of what we're seeing lately is climate change as well. Obviously that's not directly related to urban areas, but it's really, really, we feel it the most in urban areas in terms of the proximity to people, or it does mean that big wilderness areas are burning as well. Yeah, a lot of the climate change factors are, obviously we're having, when the weather is hot and dry, it's hotter and drier. When it's wet, it's wetter, which means that plants are growing more, so we have a higher fuel load. And then dry season, it's a lot drier. We're seeing more red days, more high fire danger index days. And the fires are burning more intensely because it's a 30-degree day with less than 30% humidity and really high wind speeds, and that means that those fires are super intense and really, really difficult to stop. And those fires are burning for longer. So I don't know if anyone's noticed, we've had a lot of multi-day fires on the peninsula, especially over the last couple of years. So it's something that always happened once in a while. It was 2000, and it was the next really big one was 2015, but now we're seeing it every 2-3 years, these really, really big ones. And every year we go, what's left to burn? And then there's always something left to burn. It also means that if it's really hot, and hot consistently for a number of days, that a lot of those, what you think is out is still really, really hot. So unless you get water to every square inch of that fire, stuff can still flare up again. This is from the Simonstown fire. I'm sure you were all around for that. So that was our most notable one from this last season. It was 8 days of suppression, and that's from initial attack, from when that fire first started, to the end of mop-up. So you can see that mop-up takes a good 2-3 days at least at the end. And obviously it burned multiple areas, multiple sections. There were a lot of resources required. We all pulled multiple shifts with our minimum rest period in between to make sure that we did it safely. But it really was, I think, in the time I've been with VWS, the biggest, apart from maybe 2015, the highest amount of resources needed. There was, I think, just from Table Mountain National Park side, about 250 firefighters or firefighting resources, excluding City of Cape Town, which is, yeah, and that was just on one day. And people called in from all over as well. So it means that these fires are persisting for longer. There were times where everything went really calm, but then all of a sudden weather changed and everything flared up again, but in all directions, so everything was split as well. On that, this is also from Simon's time. When fires get really big, we don't see it a lot on the peninsula because we don't have enough area sometimes. But we saw it on Simon's Town and we've seen it on the UCT fire as well. Fires create their own weather systems. So you have a lot of this hot air going up, it hits in the colder air at the top, and it cools down and then collapses on itself as well. So that means you have this area burning, but as the air collapses, it all shoots out in all directions. So you get wind directions in every direction. Fires can cause, so we what we call pyrocumulus clouds, so it's a thundercloud, but because of that hot air rising. So you can get lightning strikes just from that fire. Everywhere else can be clear. It looks very weird, and it's very dangerous as well because it's very volatile, very unstable conditions. So as much as we plan for forecasts and all those kinds of things, really on a fire, anything can happen. We get things like fire tornado or firewalls, which are like little dust devils but on flame. And then in America, in really big fires, they get fire tornadoes. So it's really just a lot of this hot air moving through and just creating tornado damage, but also with fire. So that's just something that we're seeing more of, and that's really the only explanation is climate change as well. So I don't know if you remember the game, the UCT fire, where it was burning up the mountain and suddenly it crossed the M3. That was a collapse of a pyrocumulus cloud. So that was that air system collapsing and just pushing everything downstream, which is just really, really dangerous and really, just not nice fire behavior as well. It's with these big things as well. This is when once that heat hits the upper air columns or air winds, that's when embers can then travel kilometers, as well as the heat and flaring up in different directions. Sometimes pyrocumulus clouds can cause rain as well. We don't always like rain. It makes conditions quite dangerous, and a lot of landslides and things like that. But obviously we'll take help where we can get it. But what we've seen this last season is that rain and high humidity don't really wash if that fire is intense enough. That is me. So that was a lot of information, but like I said, we can talk about this all day. But I really just hope it gave you a bit of a background into, firstly, why we're fighting fires in fynbos, which is often the argument or the concern, but also just some of the challenges that we deal with, and why you're seeing more fires as well.